Thank you for coming to my session, viewing my session. I've been retired for 11 years now. I started in 1966 and taught at Villanova for 45 years until 2011. But I have never taught a course this way, that is on Zoom. So I'm very much an amateur at this. I apologize, I don't have the best handwriting, but I'm hoping you can read this. I'm going to read it first, then put it up for you to read it for yourself to get some ideas about what I'm doing. In governing a nation, that nation must decide two questions: the political question of how to make laws, and the practical alternatives are two: democracy or autocracy. And the second question that the nation must decide is the economic question of how to distribute scarce resources. There are two choices: socialism and capitalism. So we're going to be talking about democracy, autocracy in politics, and capitalism and socialism in economics. Now, I want you to get used to the idea that they can be combined in various ways. That is, you can't have democracy, which is also autocracy, because they're opposite and they're both political ways. But you can have democracy, the political way of making laws, and socialism, one way of organizing the economy. But you could also have democratic capitalism, and you could have autocratic capitalism, and you could have autocratic socialism. Now, what roughly do each of those four words mean? What is a short definition enough for you to see what I'm doing by making my contrasts? Notice democracy here. It means government of the people, for the people, by the people. That's from Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Government of the people, by the people, for the people. It will mean more things, as I'll explain to you, but it's everybody gets some chance to help in ruling. If you had direct democracy, you'd have every decision made in a polity by a majority vote of the whole population. We have representative democracy. We have what's called a republic. All that the word republic means, it comes from two ancient, well, Latin words. Latin was an ancient language. Res is the word for thing. Publica is public things. So a republic is a organization of government which takes care of how public things are distributed. So republic is not an alternative word to democrat or democratic. That is, we have a representative democracy, and that is a republic in the usual sense. Now, capitalism. Capitalism means creating regulated markets so goods can be sold and bought. Free markets, profit. Regulated markets so goods can be created or bought. Where does the capital part of capitalism come in? Well, if you want to make a lot of the items, say the items are automobiles, you need a lot of money to begin with to set up your factories, set up your plants. Factories are full of capital goods. Capital goods are goods which generate consumer goods like cars. So capitalism seeks money, in our case, for capital goods to build things like factories, and then you create a free economy. And the supply and demand and the desire to sell for a profit is one influence, but your worry that your competitor will sell for less on a free market restrains you from asking for an obscene profit. You ask for an obscene profit for your Chevys, the Ford people will only ask for a small profit and they'll sell many more cars than you. So here's some beginning understandings of what democracy is and what capitalism is. Autocracy. The Latin, well, actually Greek roots of the word autocracy are very important. Auto means self, like an automobile. Automobile means self-moving, a vehicle which moves itself. And the C-R-A-C-Y part is form of government. So monocracy, I'll take oligarchy. Oligarchy means government by the few. Autocracy means government by, well, government for the self. But in the sense that I'm using it, government for the self could include not only one single self person, like a tyrant or a dictator, but remember that tyrant or dictator will have, for instance, goons to support him, to beat other people who are trying to overcome him. So autocracy is practically meant here by government of the one or few, for the one or few, by the one or few. It's essentially selfishness, the kind of selfishness which might be shown if you lose an election according to the rule of law, but you want to still claim you won the election, and so you want to selfishly hold on to government. That would be a good example of one kind of selfishness. And then lastly, socialism. Socialism means guaranteeing scarce resources to all, especially the poor. Means guaranteeing necessary resources to all, especially the poor. Now, you might think that's not what socialism is, and I'm going to explain what has happened to give it a much worse reputation. But if you read some of the great socialists before Marx, you will see that he was very different from what they are. He claimed to have scientific socialism. And what was scientific about his socialism was he claimed there are always, will always be two classes. There's a class of the property owners, especially those who own productive property. And then there's the class of those who work the productive property, who use the productive property to make consumer goods. And always, according to Marx, the upper class has exploited the lower class. Think about serfdom. There were the lords, they're the upper class. They owned all the agricultural space around the castle. And then think of the serfs who had to work with the mules or the oxen or what have you, and generate the food. See, in that area, in that bit of time, the two classes of property owners and property workers relied upon agricultural wealth. But as you know now, agriculture is no longer the great source of wealth. Factories are. Factories which need, in the beginning, they needed rivers because they were mills. A factory and a mill were the same thing at that period in England, when industrialization began. So there were cotton mills, for instance, textile mills. That just meant that all the looms, and it took a great bit of genius to invent really good looms. All those looms, though, were moved by water power through the water mills. Now, that brings us then to what Marx had to say about how to cure the exploitation of the workers, they're the proletariat, how to cure their exploitation by the bourgeoisie. So for Marx, there were two classes, bourgeoisie and proletariat. And the proletariat were terribly used, abused, exploited by the bourgeoisie. Well, Marx said there are historical laws. He was working with Hegel's thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Hegel thought that the whole of world history developed in a threefold logic. Something presented itself, for instance, being. It was opposed by its opposite, its antithesis. So thesis being, antithesis non-being. But there has to be a synthesis of these two opposites. Yes, said Hegel in the beginning of his metaphysics, that's becoming. That is becoming. Change is midway between being and non-being. If you're becoming an artist, right, you start out from being a non-artist, and then you change gradually by accepting levels of being of an artist until you're an artist. If you're dying, you start from living, and in that kind of change, you lose a little bit of the life force now, more later, more after that, till you're entirely dead. So becoming is the synthesis of non-being and being. Now, what is going to happen, according to Karl Marx, is that there's going to be a final synthesis, and this opposition between the bourgeoisie and the proletarian will necessarily lead to a violent revolution, because the upper class does not want to yield power. So there will be a violent revolution. And in that violent revolution, the proletariat will seize power for a time, but then they will institute a classless society. Once there's a classless society, there need be no more revolution, no more working out of opposites, because they are overcome in this final synthesis, which he named communism. Now, before communism, there's the dictatorship of the proletariat. The dictatorship of the proletariat means finally the proletariat are going to have their needs met, are going to be able to enjoy all the wonderful products that come from the factories. Remember, the bourgeoisie now are the factory owners. By the way, Marx claimed, I'm not an economist, because economics is defined as the way to distribute, or ways to distribute, scarce goods. That is, what's the best way if you only have 80 automobiles, but you have 100 people willing to get automobiles? What's the best way to distribute those 80 automobiles? Well, capitalism says who can pay the most for them. But if the factorization, the industrialization, the use of science in industry achieves so great perfection because of the very good scientists we have, especially in the United States and England at the time of the Industrial Revolution, if the factories are so well fit with new kinds of equipment every year, then 10 years later is better equipment, then there won't be any scarcity of goods. So Marx held, because capitalism has done a good job of bringing about an enormous abundance of goods, with abundance, there's no scarcity. So I'm not, Karl Marx said, I'm not going to tell you that you have to pay a whole lot to get an automobile. There will be automobiles for everybody. They're so abundant, the price will go so low, it will be wonderful for everybody. Now, when the dictatorship of the proletariat is over, then the remainder of the bourgeoisie class, who might be fighting back after they lost in the revolution, they are completely neutralized, and so there will be a classless society. And in this classless society, the abundance of goods will make everybody happy. So notice that is socialism, which I just suggested to you here. means guaranteeing scarce resources to all, especially the poor, natural need, except the word scarce isn't needed anymore. And that's why everybody's natural needs will be met. But remember a difference that I showed you in these four definitions. Capitalism works with profit. Socialism works with need. That is to say, needs can be artificial or natural. If you go back to some of the philosophers after Plato, you'll see this, the Epicureans, the Stoics. Natural needs are things like needs for food. But if you claim that in your need for food, you need very expensive kinds of food, like, what do you call the fish roe that is, sorry, it's
Caviar.
Caviar, yeah. If you claim you can only meet your need for food with caviar, you're stressing what is an artificial need, not a natural need. So it's only natural needs for food, for things like that, which need to be met, or which would be met in a genuine socialism. Now, having given you some idea that socialism is trying to feed everybody without them necessarily paying a lot of money for it, I want to introduce you to another set of notions which are going to make a lot of sense, I think, for what I say. Sometimes take a look at the 1948 UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Sometime take a look at it. I used it. I'm reaching here for a copy I used to hand out to my students. This is a copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Notice you can get it all on one page. And notice that it has articles. Each one of these paragraphs is an article. What you should also know about this is that it is one of the most important documents brought about by the Second World War. Now, if you think about what the UN did immediately after the Second World War, well, in 1945, it formed. What did it do then? Well, it couldn't form without a constitution, so the UN Charter. The UN Charter was the first of these two documents. The UN Charter told every nation, do not be an aggressor nation. Do not cross over your borders. Do not try to take the land or change the governance system of the nation next to you or any other nation. So the UN Charter was to preserve peace. The UN Charter, had it existed before, Hitler would have said, Adolf, do not take Poland. Adolf, do not take Czechoslovakia. Adolf, do not take France. Adolf, do not take Italy or send Mussolini there. That is to say, it would guarantee world peace if it were followed and if all of its provisions were fully carried out. It hasn't been a perfect document because the UN Security Council, which is the group of the 5 nations who were the winners of World War II, because they have the most power. That's the United States, it was the U.S.S.R, France, China, and England. But at any rate, that's the first document. But the second document was looking at the internal affairs of countries. So the UN Charter is telling Germany not to take Czechoslovakia. But the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, ooh, gotta stop the phone. The Universal, I'm back. Hello? Am I back? Can you see me?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights would tell Hitler, do not harm your citizens. Do not do good to them and do not harm them. So the one charter, UN Charter says, don't harm other nations. The second document, this, largely engineered by Eleanor Roosevelt, and 1948, 3 years after the founding of the UN Declaration of Human Rights says, help your citizens, be decent to your citizens, don't interfere with them when they are enjoying their freedom. Now, you can see that mine is very much marked up, my one-page copy. I used to give this to my students. It's largely marked up because there's a clear division between kinds of rights in this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. One kind of rights are the kind of rights that the Western democracies wanted. That is, they wanted government of the people, by the people, for the people, yes, but they also wanted various kinds of freedoms, like freedom of religion. Let me go through the kind of rights you'll see in the first part of this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Freedom of religion, freedom, have to put the hang the phone on. Sorry. Freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, a right to participate in government, freedoms that have to do with property, for instance, freedoms that have to do with not being interfered with by a criminal justice system when you're doing simple things. All these freedoms, including fair courts, courts that guarantee you freedoms to enjoy whatever your nationality or ethnicity is, the kind of freedom to decide to have children or not to have children, things like that. Freedoms to raise a family, freedoms to have a house. Okay, these were important to the Western democracies. Think of Locke's life, liberty, property, right? Freedom so that nobody takes your life. Liberty so that you can move around, do things with your money if you want. Property, once again, freedom to have and keep a house and a bank account and money, all important to Western democracy. But what happened after that, that is after these first rights, and these are the rights in most of this article, but beginning with Article 22, something else happens. In the first group of rights, the government simply leaves you alone. But what people thought about as they were finishing that, and they were thought about it largely because there were socialists who were making their plea, is we don't want the government to leave us entirely alone. If I am without property and I sleep under a bridge at night, because that's the only cover from rain or snow that I can get, I don't want the government to let me alone. I want the government to have found some kind of housing for me. And if I'm starving and I can't feed my children, I don't want to be left alone by government. I want the government to have something like food stamps so that my children can eat. And same goes with clothing, but especially, for instance, for medical care. If I have some disease and I can't pay high medical expenses, I want the government to provide free medical care for me. Now, it's free in one sense, but what the government should first do is guarantee me a job with a living wage, and then I'll be able to pay for it. So I'll be able to pay for what sounds like free medical care until you realize that the cost of that medical care was deducted in taxes from my paycheck, and my paycheck was a paycheck for a living wage. So the Articles 22 through 26 or so have to do with what are called not formal human rights. Formal human rights, the government leaves you alone, but material human rights. The government gives you things you need if you need them and can't afford them yourself. So for instance, let me just give you a first reading of some of these articles. Article 22. Everyone as a member of a society has the right to social security as entitled to realization through national effort of the economic, social, and cultural rights indispensable for his dignity and free development of his personality. Now, it goes on to tell you what some of these economic rights are. Article 23, everyone has the right to work, free choice of employment, and protection against unemployment. 2, everyone without any discrimination has the right to equal pay for equal work. 3, everyone who works has the right to just and favorable remuneration, ensuring for himself and his family an existence worthy of human dignity and supplemented if necessary by other means of social protection. 4, everyone has the right to join trade unions. Article 24, everyone has the right to rest and leisure. Article 25, everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and welfare of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care. Motherhood and childhood are especially entitled to care and assistance. Article 24, everyone has the right to education. Education shall be free, at least in the elementary and fundamental stages. Higher education should be equally accessible to all on the basis of merit. Education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality and to its strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. Now, what I'm trying to show you is that at the core of socialism are human rights. That is to say, a right is an entitlement. A justified right is a justified entitlement. That is, you have a claim to it. A right is a justified claim. A human right is a justified claim, justified by the fact that you're a human being. Human beings are different from the animals. Human beings, from the point of view of traditional Catholic theology, are down from the angels, but they're still, even though down from the angels from God, they're still above the animals. And even with Darwin and evolution, which is atheistic and doesn't need or want to talk, about God, the humans are up. That is, they're the top of the evolutionary movement up. So humans, in either way of looking at it, theistic or atheistic, looking at it through divinity or through evolution, humans are separate and different and dignified. To be dignified is to have human rights. Human dignity is the demand for and guarantee of human rights to people. So socialism is trying to say, as human beings, we should be working for these things for one another. It can be done to some degree, sure, all of us, by being nice to one another, by providing charity to one another. But when you give someone enough to eat by charity, it's not the same as that person being able to make the claim injustice. That is, your neighbor has no claim on you in charity because the $100 that he wants to help paying his rent, you might also need for your son or daughter's rent someplace. He has no right, that is your neighbor, to this $100, but he does have a right against humans in your government organization collectively. He does have a right to just compensation to allow him to pay his rent. So what we're getting at now is this. When you take a look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you will find, I'll read this then show it to you. Democracy is supported by the human rights in the first part of the Declaration, rights to freedom of speech, assembly, religion, majority rule, etc. That is, democracy is supported by human rights. But so is socialism. Socialism is supported by the human rights in the second part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, rights to a job, food, clothing, housing, medical care, education. Now, if democracy is based on one part of the Declaration of Human Rights guaranteeing it, and if socialism is based on the second part, and if the truth about capitalism and socialism is this, that is to say, supported by no human rights, are left out autocracy and capitalism. That is, capitalism can do wonderful things to get a lot of people eating and driving expensive cars and things like that. And autocracy can do wonderful things for giving riches to the dictator or the oligarchs and their friends, but they're not based on human rights. Now, I'm not saying that capitalism does not by itself generate goods and maybe even generate them aplenty. And Marx granted that. That's why he said, because capitalism with industrialization had succeeded so well, that's why we can now have a revolution and keep the industrial perfection that capitalism had come to. We'll keep that, but instead of using it just for the autocratic few, we'll use it for the democratic many. So notice what we're getting here, and I hope this will shake some of you up. What I've done so far allows us to make a scale of the best and worst forms of government. And here we go. Democratic socialism is the best. Notice I have 1 yes, 2 yes. What 1 yes, 2 yes means is the first group of human rights, the rights to freedoms of various kinds, is guaranteed by democracy. And the second group of human rights, 2 yes, the human rights that guarantee you food, housing, education, medical care, is guaranteed by socialism. So that would be the best form of government. I am partial to Bernie Sanders. I voted for him as often as I could in the last 2 elections. But you don't have to look for Bernie socialism and what's people say are his unrealizable ideals. The ideals are realized. If you just take a look at the Scandinavian countries, maybe especially Sweden, Norway, and if you take a look at Germany, you'll find that basically, even though Germany still calls itself a capitalistic country, if you understand socialism by guaranteeing those human rights, it's a democratic socialistic country. Now, do they shy away from the word socialism? Somewhat, yes, because the United States makes such a big thing out of being capitalistic. But the political party which began this in Germany was the the Social Democratic Party. Europe is chock full of social democratic parties. That's why Scandinavia is what it is, democratic socialism, because of these social democratic parties or pure socialistic parties. That is, in many countries of Europe, the socialistic, I think Spain now, if I remember correctly, has a government formed by a majority socialistic party. France has recently. It's always been around in Germany and other places. It's important in Europe because it's no shame to be a socialist. Now, what would be the next best government? Probably democratic capitalism. And notice I have over here 1 yes, 2 no. Democratic capitalism, take Ronald Reagan as an example, would stress capitalism to a great extent. It wouldn't entirely make impossible things like food stamps. You know, they've existed under Ronald Reagan and people. Public housing, you know that's existed, but it wouldn't go out of its way to generate these things for everybody that needs them. I've just seen, for instance, lists of those that need public housing in the city of Philadelphia, and the number of those who are waiting for units from the Philadelphia Housing Authority, which is what runs socialistic housing in Philadelphia, the number of people is something like 4 or 5 times the available units or the units already occupied. So we don't do a good job. Well, when Republicans tend to be in government, they don't absolutely destroy all unions, which are big to socialism, but they try to keep them in check. And Amazon succeeds in getting all those in its Atlanta stores to repudiate unionization when they get a chance to vote. But it looks like there's going to be another vote because the National Labor Relations Board does not think that the vote was fair. And by the way, the reason I don't think the vote was fair is they prohibited any workers who were for the union in these Amazon warehouses from distributing information inside the factory, which is not usual for fair elections like that. Okay, notice the third as we go down the list from the best to the worst. So democratic socialism is best, democratic capitalism. It's done a pretty good job in the United States. Yes, there's a lot of poor, but I feel quite comfortable. It's done a good job for me, but at the expense, I think, of poor people. Autocratic socialism. Autocratic socialism is what we would call communism. Autocratic socialism is bad. Now, that it's autocratic meant that people like Joseph Stalin were dictators. Lenin before him, Joseph Stalin. Took a while for them to get rid of the system in which the prime man, the prime minister, was a socialist. But at any rate, notice that it calls itself socialism, so that must mean it did some of the good things, and it did. People do not seem to realize that in the Soviet Union, you had a right to housing. Now, what did that mean? Well, because it was autocratic, it wouldn't be a way to assign housing in a democratic way, a fair way. So what it would mean was, if you had in a important big capital apartment house, if you had a big apartment because you had a family of 6 and you were an important person under the Tsar, when the revolution occurred, a commissar would come knocking on your door, would say, how many rooms to this apartment? When you gave him the truth, 14 rooms, then the commissar would say to you, okay, here's 2 additional families to live in your apartment. So yes, there's guaranteed housing, but it's at the expense of that right to property, which is crucial to capitalism, and which is not at all inimical to socialism. That is, there would be a right to property because of democracy, but it's reinforced by socialism because if you have a right to a house, the most secure way to have a right to a house is have it as your property. Another example of communism under the Soviet Union as a genuine form of socialism, which provides good for poor people. Let's say you had no skills, you had not been poorly educated under the Tsar, you still wanted to make a living somehow, you were guaranteed a job. That is, in the Soviet Union, there was no level of unemployment because at least formally, whoops, I just messed up my screen a little bit. In the Soviet Union, at least formally, everyone had a job. Now, what kind of job? Oh, I messed it up. And where? I'm trying to get myself back into.
You're good, Joe. We can see you.
Okay, I did mess up my screen a little bit, but not terribly. Let's say you wanted a job, you needed a job, and because it's a socialistic government, it guarantees a job. Okay, you will be a street cleaner. You will be given a broom. You will be sent out to Red Square in Moscow to make sure there's no trash. You are guaranteed that job. You're guaranteed a salary. You're guaranteed housing, but you cannot change your job. That is, you cannot say, I don't want to live in Moscow where the cost of living is high. I want to go off into one of the provinces. I will be a street sweeper if you want, but things will be better there. There's more housing, better housing, and so forth. The Soviets wouldn't let you do that. The commissars would stop it. So notice the commissars get you a job, but not the job you might want, maybe not the job you're qualified for. Now, because the Soviet Union did guarantee good education, and here's another way their socialism was good. Because they guaranteed good education, you would be allowed to not only finish primary school and secondary school, but if you could pass the merit exams, you'd go on to college. And if you could pass the graduate record exams, you'd go on. And if you could be a PhD in nuclear physics, they'd love it if you had that ability, and we'd be happy to keep you in education through to the PhD. You can help us build nukes or something else. So the Soviet Union was very good in allowing the education of all up to their full potential. Now, they're sloppy about it. Sure, commissars' daughters got more chances than other people's daughters, but still, they didn't want to waste the potential of their citizens. They needed it for the science, which they knew had made capitalism so great. Okay, so let me give you one other example of communism being good, a limited good, because it was socialistic: medical care. There was, at least in principle, very good medical care in the Soviet Union. For one reason, it's because besides the ordinary doctors, they created a kind of provisional doctor. It would be something like someone between a nurse practitioner and an MD in our system, and they tended to be women. These women were quite good first care doctors, as it were, first provider doctors, quite good. They wouldn't be surgeons and things like that, wouldn't be specialists in neurology, but they'd be good, and it made for good medical care. Now, I'm telling you that there is something good about the Soviet Union. That's what keeps them from being the worst of the forms of government. But let me tell you that the autocratic part made them very bad. All the people sent to gulags, all the show trials of who had those in the 30s, there were show trials of those who had been good followers of Lenin as communists, but Stalin didn't like them. So there were trials and they were put to death. And it was horrible for anyone trying to exercise freedom to oppose the government. There was only one political party, the Communist Party. It went back on the plea that we would be a classless society by having two classes, clear classes of commissars and serfs, ordinary people, ordinary Ivans. So the autocratic part made it a hell to live in many ways, but the communistic part had some good aspects about it. And we see the same thing in China now. That is, that's one reason why many Chinese are loyal to their government, because many of the promises of socialism are still guaranteed them. Not as many as under Mao, but many. Well, let's look at this worst form of government, autocratic socialism. Autocratic socialism. I'm sorry, autocratic capitalism. Now, many people think of capitalism as good, and it's hard to see why anyone would call it bad. Well, here's why it's bad. What autocratic capitalism means is something like what you'd have if you had a dictator and there was private property. That is, under socialism, the government might own a lot of businesses, but let's say you as a dictator are going to allow those businesses to be private property, but they will be the private property of your relatives, your friends, just a bunch of people. That is to say, autocratic capitalism will be that kind of family capitalism. There's a word for it that I was using that I can't bring back to myself at the moment, but it's something like comrade capitalism. Your comrades can have the property owned. Now, I give an example of that besides saying Saudi Arabia. Well, think of Saudi Arabia, right? There's the royal family, and the royal family is large because the sultans have, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 wives. You know, they have their whole harem. So there's plural marriages, and there's the royal family, and there's princes and princesses all over the place, and they are given the important jobs. Do ordinary Saudis have important jobs? Well, it is true. If you were born in Saudi Arabia of lower class Saudis, you would have more rights than if you were, for instance, someone from Lebanon who went there to work, someone from the Philippines who went there to work, someone from, no, Taiwan wouldn't have, Taiwan's in the better class of things. But if you went there from some poor country to work, you'd have almost no rights at all. For instance, the stories of women, maybe from the Philippines, someplace like that, who go to Saudi Arabia to be nannies for kids, to be maids in the house. The stories of them are sad, so sad. They have no rights. They have, sometimes they're not paid. Sometimes they're sexually abused. Saudi Arabia is a good example of a very capitalistic country. And so the United States loves it because we can make capitalistic investments there, and our right to property is respected. But it is very much in favor for the few at the top. Now, I mentioned a more neighborly example of this when I put down Anastasio Somoza. Anastasio Somoza, until the successful Sandinista revolution in 1978, I think, or 79, was an autocratic capitalist. He was an autocratic capitalist who owned much of the wealth of the city and the country. The capital city, Managua, Nicaragua, was the center of wealth. He was a capitalist who gave important parts of his wealth to his children and others. He was a man who was cruel. He tortured opponents and things like that. It's interesting that he graduated from West Point. He was the last in his class at West Point. But he used to brag in the United Nations that whatever the United States votes for, I will vote for. I will never depart from the voting preferences of the United States. And that tended to be the United States under Republican governments. When Jimmy Carter came along and had a human rights-based foreign policy, Anastasio Somoza was not in accord with a decent respect for human rights. So his comrade capitalism had to go, and the Sandinistas got rid of it. Now, the Sandinistas, and they've had an unfortunate history since, because one of the leaders of the Sandinistas is now the president of Nicaragua, but he has diverted from the original Sandinista impetus. It had 5 members of a group that ruled the country at first. And 2 of those 5 members were priests. And they were priests who very much favored liberation theology. They were priests who accepted the Catholic respect for all the human rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. If the United States had not opposed their movement towards socialism, Nicaragua would have turned out, I believe, to be a democratic, socialistic government. It put a constitution in effect, which was an ideal democratic, socialistic constitution, very respectful of all the human rights which were based on needs. So if the United States had not seen that what they were doing tended towards socialism, the United States would not have handled them in such a way as to prohibit them from being fully democratic. Now, let me skip from there to another example, which makes this point I'm making more strongly. The point I'm trying to make, let me just use this. I guess I forgot to show this to you when I was on my way to showing what the best and worst forms of government are. This says democratic socialism, medical care for all, jobs for all, housing for all, living wages for all. And then education through graduate school for all with the potential to accept that education. And then I continue, nutrition, food for all, government control only where profit motive fails. That is, the profit motive failed in American railroads. The Pennsylvania Railroad was one of the great glories of capitalism. It had something like 80 straight years of paying big dividends every quarter, the Pennsylvania Railroad, but it started faltering. Its union with the New York Central Railroad did not save it, and now it is the socialized railroad of the United States, whose name is, help me with its name. The government railroad system is named?
Amtrak?
Amtrak, that's Amtrak. Amtrak is socialized railroads. I also, okay, I want to give you this example of what it means to be this worst kind of country, this autocratic capitalism, what it means as opposed to being democratic socialism. You realize that if someone succeeded in overthrowing democratic socialism, to overthrow the democracies, to install autocracy, to overcome socialism is to install capitalism. If you succeed in overthrowing a democratic socialist government, and I'm claiming that the United States refused to let the Sandinista revolution become that, but if you fully succeed, you will get the worst kind of government. Okay, I have an example of that. Check it out for yourself. I think you'll have to tell me that I'm pretty close to the truth here. Chile. Chile under Salvador Allende in the early 90s. Chile was a democratic country. Chile had regular democratic elections. For years, and this is true in most Latin American countries because of the difference between the Spanish oligarchy and the mestizo populace. Mestizo means mixed. Mixed means Spanish blood mixed with Indian blood. Latin America has some aristocrats from pure Spain, but many, many, many more mestizos. And the reason why, by the way, is that when Latin America was settled, it was settled by conquistadores, by conquerors, generals with soldiers. If all men come to a country, the men want wives. If they don't want wives, they want sex, so they're going to have babies even if they're not married. And that's what happened. And that's why there's so many mestizos in Latin America. But there are the pure Spanish who stay together, the original settlers from Spain who want to keep their purity. And so they have tended to rule Latin American governments. What happened then was that before the 90s, the poor people were putting up with the dominance of what you'd call an oligarchy, the few wealthy ruling them. They succeeded, though, with Salvador Allende in the early 1990s in Chile. He was, by democracy, through democracy, elected president, even though he advertised before the election that he was a socialist. So his government starts out as a democratic socialist government with changes that very much helped the ordinary people, changes in education, changes in healthcare, changes in housing, changes in who gets to eat, and so forth. He makes a very good beginning. But there were very big capitalistic enterprises in Chile which had investors from the United States. And that was especially the telephone company. I don't know if it was AT&T, it maybe had a Chilean name, but it had a lot of investors who had also stocks. Maybe it was even a part of AT&T, Atlantic, yes, Atlantic Telephone and Telegraph. And the big capitalists in the United States went to the president, trying to remember who the president was at this time. Was it Nixon in the early 90s? Who was president? It was a Republican president. At any rate, the American capitalists went to the president and said, we can't allow this socialism to grow in our backyard. We can't allow that. South America is ours because of the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was insisted by President Monroe. Europe, you're done colonizing in the Western Hemisphere. You're done colonizing in North America. You're done colonizing in South America. South America belongs to we, democratic capitalists in North America. And we want capitalism there. Yes, we'll accept democracy as long as it yields capitalism. But in Chile, Salvador Allende was not yielding capitalism, was not allowing for capitalism. So what happens is, I have to look at my clock. Oh, I have to stop in a couple of minutes. What happens is, but that's all right, I'm at the end. What happens is the United States overthrows the Allende government. That is the United States, the CIA, other people. Go and see the movie Missing if you can find it, MISSING, made 20, 30 years ago. The United States overthrows that government and puts a dictator in. The dictator was General, I just wrote his name down someplace, Pinochet. Puts a dictator in to restore capitalism. And the all the things that had been turned over to socialistic purposes are restored to their old private ownership and oligarchic functions. So at any rate, I think I've completed my argument. I'm trying to show you that there is a good kind of socialism, democratic socialism. Yes, Bernie Sanders represents it, but so does people in Sweden, in Germany, in Scandinavia. Even Canada comes close to democratic socialism. There is a good kind of socialism. It's like theirs. There are bad kinds of socialism, like the Soviet Union. Cuba has a lot of things bad with it, but it generates some socialistic benefits at the same time. At any rate, thank you. Can I take questions or should I end up? I guess I have to end up, don't I, Vito?
Well, if anyone wishes to ask a question or so, we have a few minutes. If you need to go somewhere else, please feel free to drop off the meeting. But go ahead.
I have a question.
Yes.
I was wondering if, like, I know that this is most likely a hypothetical because I don't think it could ever happen, but if there was some way that we, like the United States, became a socialist nation, do you think that that would even be remotely possible, like in the future? What do you think it would look like?
You have just given me a chance to say something I should have said. Okay, we have capitalism, right? We have the private ownership of the big industries and things like that, right? Amazon and all that. But we have the power of taxation. Now, let's say we taxed all those industries and all the wealthy people, you know, the 1% that we hear so wealthy, so that we could guarantee all of our citizens of the, you know, everywhere down from 90%, guarantee them all their needs. Without calling ourselves socialistic, we would be what I'm describing as democratic socialism. So you don't have to give up the name capitalism to be a democratic socialist country. What people usually object to in socialism is the government ownership of all productive property. But taxation can take care of the benefits of them to such a degree that you could have what is in effect a socialistic country without having to name it so. So that's kind of cheating, but that's the way I see the situation.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question. It gave me a chance to bring that out. I wanted to bring that out.